Hello everyone, welcome to another video of French philosophers. We've already made it to our 8th philosopher thus far, and today I have a philosopher that I myself am not familiar with a lot that I wanted to share with you guys. Through studying while preparing all these slides, I was able to look into his writing, and I have to say I was fascinated by a lot of the profound ideas that he raised, and I'm excited so much that you guys are able to share part of this excitement that he, all the way from the 1900s, has kindled for us. Yeah, so the philosopher we have today is Paul Ricoeur. Let's get right started. So Paul Ricoeur, born in 1913 and passed away in 2005, was a French philosopher whose work bridged existentialism, phenomenology, and hermeneutics, fundamentally shaping modern thought on interpretation, narrative identity, and the philosophy of time. And we're going to be looking into all of these ideas very, very soon. Unlike philosophers who sought absolute truths, he focused on how meaning is created, shaped, and understood through things like language, symbols, and stories. Very, very interesting, very unique approach. The central theme, I think, in his philosophy was the idea that humans understand themselves through narratives, both personal and collective, as a society and for individuals. His contributions spanned multiple disciplines, including philosophy, theology, literary theories, and social sciences, making him one of the most interdisciplinary thinkers of the 20th century. Yeah, Ricker's intellectual journey was deeply shaped by historical events, particularly the World War II, just like Albert Camus that we looked at, in which he was a prisoner of war for 5 years. This experience led him to reflect on suffering, evil, and memory, pushing him toward a philosophy that engages with history, ethics, and human resilience. His key works, as we will see, The Symbolism of Evil and the Time and Narrative, explores each of these, how we construct meaning through interpretation, influencing fields as diverse as literary criticism, for example, political thought, and psychology. And through his unique fusion of these existentialist concerns that look into human freedom, for example, with hermeneutic explorations of language and text, Ricoeur developed a philosophy that remains vital today, particularly in discussions of mental capacities like memories and conceptual ideas like justice and historical truth. Let's look more into his time. So, as we have said, he was influenced by World War II, but he also lived during a period of philosophical upheaval in the mid 20th century. After the horrors of World War II, I think many philosophers, such as Jean Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, turned to existentialism, questioning human freedom, responsibility, and meaning in the face of chaos. And while Sartre focused on radical freedom and Camus on the absurdity of existence, Ricoeur took a different path. He saw meaning not as something self-created, as existentialists claimed, but as something we interpret through symbolism, text, and history. His work was also deeply influenced by phenomenology, particularly the ideas of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, who emphasized the structures of our experience and how meaning emerges from these different perceptions. And Ricoeur, I think, takes this farther by asking a variety of different questions. First of all, about how narratives and how all these different symbols in our world can shape the reality in which we live. How do historical events and occurrences become a part of our memory as an individual, but also, more importantly, as a collectivity? And how do people construct the identities from the narratives that they tell? And to answer the questions, I think he has developed all these different philosophies, and he seeks the understanding to really find the gap between language, interpretation, and culture, human experience. Yeah, so let's look into his first book. His first book was The Symbolization of Evil, written in 1960, and it is a critical work in which he tries to figure out how society understands and represents evil through language, myth, and religious narratives. Yeah, so I think this is very interesting because it kind of raises evil as a very symbolic concept instead of a religious concept like in most other relig- historical context, it's very different, where it seeks kind of good and evil in very absolute terms, and the devil kind of goes right in evil, right? River argues that evil instead is understood in symbols and cultural narratives, and it's very different in understanding that civilizations have myths, they have religious texts, also they have philosophical traditions that shape their views on morality, on things like guilt, on suffering, on the various hardship that is religiously transcended in a lot of culture. No, but he does not see this in a religious sense. Instead, he says famously, evil is not only the failure to do good, it is also the excessive tendency to do evil. This highlights his belief that evil is not just the absence of morality, as in some religious traditions, but an active force that is very strongly embedded in a lot of human fabric, so in human culture, in our language, in some of our history as well. And I think we also have to look into the understanding of interpretation in our moral understanding, because Richoer's approach, I think, has a lot of moral dualisms that show how different cultures and religions use symbolic language to process suffering. He explores, for example, the biblical theories, and also the Greek tragedies, the Greek texts and playwrights, and plays, and philosophical texts, and tries to show us how all these societies constructed meaning around evil. And this perspective has had a major influence on ethics, and also on theology and the study of collective trauma, and especially in kind of trying to examine how histories dealt with just historically committed atrocities like the Holocaust and also colonialism, how religious traditions just frame these sufferings and try to redeem people, and how psychological trauma is processed through storytelling and memory. And through these understandings of human suffering and analyzing how this is deeply tied into human beings, he frames evil as a narrative and interpretive problem instead of a religious, ethical, and judicial works. And it has significant impact on how we see a lot of these ethical problems. I think we covered a lot of that. A second book I wanted to talk about was his volume masterpiece, Time and Narrative. And it is one of the most fundamental books in understanding, human life, our experience of time, and how we understand it through storytelling. So I think traditional philosophy from philosophers like Aristotle to Kant kind of viewed time as a subsequence of events. Especially, I would say Aristotle, he said past, present, future. Boop. But Richoer doesn't say that. He argues that this kind of scientific, even objective view of time just doesn't capture how human beings like us actually are experiencing it. And instead, he suggests that we try to make sense of this through narratives. So he loves his narratives, right? And so he says, we understand the past by telling stories about history, right? And we give meaning to our present by interpreting the events around us. And we may imagine the future through projected narratives, like what our hopes are, what our fears are, what our aspirations are. And I think his famous quotes here is, time becomes human time to the extent that it is organized after the manner of a story. This quote is beautiful because it is one of his central arguments. But he says that the narrative around us just provides the coherence and the understanding fabric behind time, behind all these flow in relation to the world. It just helps us to make it sense to our lives as human beings. And Richoer takes this idea even further, I think, and he argues that our personal identity in a lot of ways are shaped by how we tell this in ourselves, right? And so his impact has this idea of selfhood has had a significant impact on a lot of our modern theories as well. And for example, he would say that unlike existentialists, that our beliefs and our personal identity evolves through interpretation. So for example, an individual's identity, our identity, comes from memories. It comes from family histories. It comes from personal experiences that we went through, all structured as a whole compounding narrative that become us. In another way, for example, a nation's identity can be the historical stories that it has been through and the historical stories that it chooses to tell in the future. And again, this has significant impact in memory and trauma and self exploration and truth and the process of reconciliation with oneself. His influences are many, they are multitudinous. It shapes multiple disciplines like philosophers, literary theorists, and social scientists. And one of the key people is Hans Georg Gadamer, I believe, developed these ideas of intellectual kind of self-conception as a theory for interpretation similar to Richoer, emphasizing the role of historical context and narrative context in understanding different ideas, especially in texts. We also have Julia Kristeva. She applied, I believe it is a she. She applied Richoer's ideas to psychoanalysis and even to linguistics, and she tried to show that identity is shaped through relationships between language and meaning. So she took this to a linguistical perspective. She tried to adapt it and present it in a new field. We also have people like Paul Tillich and Charles Taylor, these theologians who are impacted by Richoer, who tried to explore faith and morality and how these are shaped through narrative perspectives. And yeah, so Richoer's legacy is highly relevant in discussions of justice and memory and language structures. He is the most influential, I think, of one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. I think the most significant, I think we could sum up, is that he kind of tried to bridge the gap between existential problems through a narrative theory, and he offered very human-focused, humanistic approaches to understanding our ideas and ethics. And I think it is a very personal philosophy as well, unlike some religions that we may face, or some very virtuous, very out there ideas. It just talks to you as an individual, as a human that is flawed, that is shaped with narrative concerns, that is fundamentally who fundamentally does not own your own narrative. I think it gives you the kind of relaxation that some people might want. Yeah, and so it just makes a essential idea in how we interpret the world. It gives a sense of self, history, morality. It's something that I think we need to construct in order to tell our stories that he wants to present. And in an era in which, we have all these different ideas of truths and interpretations and ethics, I think Richoer's insights are more important than ever. Yeah, and so his philosophy just continues to challenge us to question, interpret, and rethink the ways in which narrative continues to change our lives. And I want to kind of go away with the idea that understanding something is just never going to be final. It's always a process in which we interpret things, in which we view things as a narrative, and it's something that we are in constant battle with, that I want you to be thinking about. And yeah, this was Paul Richoer. He was one of the most influential philosophers, and it is definitely worth knowing more about. And I personally did not know about him even before I started writing this, and I'm very thankful that I got a chance to learn more about this. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and as much as I learned, I hope that you have had the chance to learn through these videos. Thank you so much. Have an amazing day, and bye-bye.